They call it the death zone. Not the peak of Everest, but the high, unforgiving slopes where the air itself turns into jagged glass and the silence is so complete it screams in your ears. This is 1650 CE, a time when the world believed the highest mountains were the thrones of angry gods, and maybe, just maybe, they were right. Deep inside the frozen belly of the roof of the world, thousands of feet above the clouds, where life should cease to exist, stood the ancient monasteries of the yellow hat tradition. These weren't structures built of warmth and comfort. They were stone fortresses against an enemy that never slept, the Himalayan winter. Can you believe that in a place where exposed flesh freezes solid in minutes, where the wind carries the sound of despair, there were men who chose to sleep, not under thick yak furs, but almost naked, inviting the lethal embrace of the ice? This is not a story of simple faith. This is a story of a biological miracle, a secret guarded for centuries, a technique so powerful it defied the laws of physics and the very decree of death. We are talking about temperatures that plunge so low, mercury itself hides in shame. -40, -50. Conditions that would turn the average human body into a useless, brittle block of ice, shattering bone and seizing organs in a brutal, silent instant. Yet, locked within those ancient walls, sat the monks, the masters of the impossible art known only as tumo, the inner fire. They didn't just survive the cold, they generated heat from pure willpower, turning their bodies into living furnaces, capable of raising their core temperature by incredible, documented margins. Imagine the scene: the venerable master, Geshe Lobsang, sitting cross-legged, the breath slowing to a near stop, his skin radiating a feverish warmth strong enough to melt the frost forming on the stone walls around him. This internal blaze was their shield, their only salvation, a testament to the power of the disciplined human mind over the crushing dominance of matter. This spiritual technology, this mastery of the elemental self, was their inheritance. It was the reason these monasteries could exist in such an absurd location, guarding knowledge that spanned millennia. But even the greatest fire can be extinguished. And a catastrophe was brewing, a disaster so unique and terrifying that even the oldest, most cryptic texts never warned them about it. It was a threat that didn't come from a sudden, blinding blizzard or a thunderous avalanche, but from a geological anomaly, a silent, creeping terror that began to steal their very life force while they slept in their meditative trance. The night was known only later as the night of the still air. Usually, the perpetual wind screamed like 1,000 tortured souls, keeping the monks perpetually alert, forcing them to constantly feed and maintain the inner flame. But tonight, there was nothing. Silence. A heavy, suffocating blanket of stillness had descended upon the valley, trapping the deadly, supercooled air right against the monastery walls. The air had achieved a state of critical, unnatural density, turning the atmosphere into a perfect conductor of heat theft. Lobsang woke first, not to the usual stinging cold that announced the dawn, but to an ominous, unnatural pressure behind his eyes. The air felt thick, dead. The inner fire, his tumo, usually a roaring, self-sustaining inferno, was struggling, sputtering like a damp wick in a vacuum. He looked across the sleeping hall. The dozens of other monks, usually vibrant with the controlled heat of their practice, were unnaturally still. Their breathing was dangerously shallow, almost imperceptible, and their skin, which should have been glistening with internal perspiration, was now coated in a fine, deathly rime of frost. This was the terrifying paradox they faced. The stillness, the lack of wind, was somehow drawing the heat right out of them, bypassing their practiced physiological defenses, stealing the very essence of their internal furnace, in a way no blizzard ever could. It was a slow-motion physiological collapse. Their bodies, tricked by the sudden, eerie external calm, had subconsciously ramped down their tumo defenses, believing the night was survivable because the wind warning was absent. They had dropped the shield, and the cold had slipped in, not with a bang, but with a chilling whisper. The process of hypothermia was already deep, insidious. Their minds were sluggish, heavy, resisting the intense focus and concentration required to ignite the flame. The cold had already begun its insidious work on their cognitive function, turning spiritual masters into ordinary men, victims of the brutal reality they had spent their lives attempting to transcend. Lobsang stumbled to his feet, the stone floor like shards of ice under his soles. He knew the timeline of severe hypothermia in these conditions was terrifyingly unforgiving. Minutes, not hours. If they didn't restart the full tumo ritual now, dozens of the holiest men in the world would simply cease to exist before the sun could touch the peaks. This was the moment the ancient texts feared, the moment the overwhelming physical world finally overcame the spiritual will. The greatest, most fiercely guarded secret of the Himalayas was about to be devoured by the very mountains that protected it. Could he wake them? Could he reignite a biological bonfire in bodies that were already half frozen, verging on death? Or would the golden age of Himalayan spiritual mastery end tonight, silently, completely, under the crushing weight of a night catastrophe no one saw coming? Get ready, because what happened next is either a legend of unparalleled human endurance or the greatest tragedy ever swallowed by the frozen peaks. You will not believe the desperate, forbidden measures Lobsang took to cheat the grim reaper of the high altitude. Measures that would shatter the traditions of 1,000 years, just to buy them one more hour of life. The stakes are beyond measure. This is the untold story of the night the inner fire almost died. The inner fire. For centuries, Western science would dismiss it as mystic folklore, yet here, etched into the very granite of the roof of the world, was the indisputable proof. Men were generating life-sustaining heat in temperatures that should have turned their blood to crystal. The stakes had been set the moment the sun dipped below the jagged spine of the mountains, plunging the valley into a state of cryogenic suspension. The air, thin and cruel, was now a weapon capable of tearing the warmth directly out of flesh in mere minutes. This was not merely cold. This was the absolute zero of the human experience. A biting, relentless pressure that sought to still the heart and silence the mind forever. In the highest chamber of the isolated monastery of Drukpa, 30 dozen monks sat motionless, their robes gossamer thin, their skin exposed to the lethal elements. They were not seeking comfort. They were seeking combustion. The patriarch, known only as Lama Kunga, a man whose wrinkles held the map of 100 frozen winters, monitored the breathing of his disciples from his central position. His own body was a furnace, running at a temperature higher than any fever, maintained by a breath technique so precise it could shatter glass. This technique, the vase breath, was the engine of Tumo. Imagine sucking the entirety of the deadly, freezing atmosphere into your core, not through the lungs alone, but drawing it down the Sushumna Nadi, the central channel believed to run along the spine. This air was compressed, pressurized, and then, through sheer willpower and the focused heat of visualization, ignited. They were literally burning the cold itself. Each inhalation was a risky intake of doom. Each exhalation, a carefully controlled explosion of metabolic waste and generated heat. The goal was to reach the causative heat, the stage where the body, ignoring its own survival mechanisms, began to prioritize burning internal energy reserves at an impossible rate. They were actively defying the laws of thermodynamics, pushing past the point of no return. Kunga watched the steam plumes rising faintly from the foreheads of the closest monks, confirmation that the inner forge was roaring. Survival wasn't measured in blankets or fires. It was measured in the diameter of the moisture stain left on a frozen sheet of cloth. A successful night meant being able to dry 3 frozen cloths draped over their bodies using only their generated heat. Failure meant instant, silent death. But tonight, the atmosphere itself felt wrong. It was too silent. Usually, even at this impossible altitude, there was the screech of high wind, the sound of the world trying to tear the monastery from its perch. Tonight, there was only a profound, suffocating stillness, the kind of stillness that precedes an avalanche, or perhaps something much worse, something unnatural. Kunga felt the shift in the air pressure first, not with his ears, but deep in his chest. The normal, brutalizing high-altitude air had suddenly become heavier, denser, as if the mountain itself had inhaled a lethal dose of ice vapor. The temperature inside the chamber, which they usually maintained just above freezing through collective tumo, began to plummet with shocking speed. It was a drop measurable not in degrees per hour, but degrees per minute. The air molecules themselves were slowing down, losing their residual kinetic energy in an unprecedented rush. It was as if a cosmic vacuum had been applied directly to the heat of the entire valley, sucking the life out of existence. This was the unforeseen variable, the catastrophic failure mechanism they had never prepared for. A cold so absolute, so sudden, it threatened to seize the very breath from their vase. One young monk named Tenzin, only a few years into his rigorous Tummo training, faltered. His breath, which should have been a steady, rhythmic piston stroke, hitched violently. His visualization, the imagined flame at the Manipura chakra, the solar plexus, flickered and vanished into the cold vacuum of the chamber. The compression faltered, and instead of combustion, the super-cold air he had drawn in began to freeze the delicate membranes of his lungs from the inside. A sharp, involuntary tremor ran through his body, not a simple shiver, but the deep internal convulsion of hypothermia taking hold of the core. Kunga's eyes snapped open, blazing like embers in the dark. He could see Tenzin's heat signature dimming, the inner fire failing to bridge the gap against the crushing exterior cold. Tenzin was going critical, entering the deadly threshold. He had only seconds remaining. Once the body fully surrenders to the killing cold, the metabolic rate drops so severely that Tummo becomes impossible to reignite. The system shuts down entirely. It is a one-way path to frozen oblivion, a swift and brutal end. Kunga had to reach him, but breaking his own intense meditative state would risk his own core temperature, jeopardizing the entire group's thermal buffer, endangering everyone. It was a horrific calculation. Sacrifice one young soul to save 35 experienced practitioners, or risk all to save the weakest link and face total annihilation. In the unforgiving world of the Himalayas, such calculations were the brutal currency of survival. Kunga chose the middle path, the path of extreme, self-destructive risk. He maintained his seated posture, but pushed the speed of his own vase breath to impossible, agonizing limits, generating a thermal spike that was nearly self-destructive to his ancient body. He channeled the explosive, sudden heat not into his own body mass, but into the atmosphere immediately surrounding Tenzin, aiming his focus like a laser beam. He was using Tummo not for personal survival, but as a localized thermal weapon, attempting to flash heat the air around the faltering monk, creating a microclimate of warmth in the suffocating cold. The effort strained every fiber of his being, twisting his ancient, weathered face into a mask of agonizing concentration and power. The sound was a low, guttural roar escaping his chest, the only noise in the deadly silence, the sound of a living furnace being stoked far beyond its safe capacity. Tenzin shuddered violently, ice crystals forming visibly on the tips of his eyelashes and eyebrows. He was trapped precisely on the threshold between life and the deep sleep of frostbite, hovering precariously. If Kunga's thermal projection was even a microsecond too slow, or his generated heat too weak, Tenzin would shatter, his internal systems ceasing operation forever. The sight was horrifying. A man fighting the physics of the universe with nothing but his own breath and mind, fighting the absolute zero. The central channel flared momentarily in Kunga, threatening to overwhelm his physical shell and burn him alive from the inside out. He was betting the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years against the raw, absolute power of the mountain's cold fury. The desperate, silent battle waged on in the darkness, a high-stakes duel between the inner fire and the cold that wanted to silence the world forever. The fire must hold, or they all die. Inside the cavern, the air was not merely cold. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the chests of the monks, trying to flatten the fragile flame of their lives. Every inhalation was a razor blade slicing into the lungs. Yet within the rigid, meditative forms, a furnace was indeed roaring. This was not metaphor, but fierce physiological reality. A controlled thermonuclear reaction deep within their core. The Tumo master, Geshe Lobsang, felt the agonizing strain most acutely. His breath, usually a smooth, continuous flow, designed to stoke the inner heat, the vase breath, was becoming jagged, almost desperate. He was battling 2 degrees below the safety margin, a chasm that the slightest lapse in concentration would turn into a frozen grave. The goal of Tumo, or Ga Tumo, was deceptively simple: to transform the deep metabolic energy of the body into heat, specifically targeting brown adipose tissue and manipulating the central nervous system to override the body's natural shivering response, which the monks considered inefficient and distracting. They had trained for decades to achieve this suicidal level of control, pushing the human body past the limits of biological possibility. Their core temperature, monitored by subtle, practiced internal senses, was supposed to be climbing, pushing the deadly needle of hypothermia back toward safety. But tonight, the climb felt like trying to push a boulder uphill on sheer ice. The environmental gradient was simply too steep, too sudden, defying all previous records of cold tolerance they had experienced. A truly terrifying phenomenon began to occur, one that the ancient texts rarely mentioned, describing it only as the silence of the mountain god. The air, which should have carried some minute vibration, some whisper of wind or snow, went utterly, absolutely still. It was a vacuum of motion, a pocket of pure, unalterated cold. This stillness was fatal. In a dynamic environment, air movement helps dissipate the immediate cold layer surrounding the body, but here, the air molecules around their bodies stopped moving entirely, becoming static. This created an insidious, insulating layer of supercooled air right against their skin, aggressively stealing heat through pure, brutal conduction. It felt, Lobsang registered, like being submerged in liquid nitrogen. Lobsang knew the critical threshold. If the outer layers of his body, the extremities, dropped too far, the core would follow with terrifying speed, cascading into terminal organ failure. He pushed his mind, a whip of pure willpower, forcing the fiery mantra through his veins, trying to visualize the energy rising from the navel center, the kunda, up the central channel, the sushumna. This was the moment where visualization had to become reality, or perish. He saw through the dim light filtering from the single sputtering oil lamp, the alarming sheen of frost beginning to form not on the icy rocks, but on the exposed skin of the younger monks' hands, where they rested loosely in their meditative mudras. This was the harbinger of death, the kiss of the mountain spirit reclaiming its dues, the first visible sign that their internal defenses were failing to hold the line. The pain was a blinding white-hot agony as the peripheral nerves screamed their death warrant, warning of frostbite and gangrene. To flinch, to shiver, to break the posture, even for a microsecond, was to surrender the entire system to chaos, to let the carefully constructed dam of heat burst and flood into the waiting, empty cold. They were balancing on the edge of a thermodynamic cliff, where one wrong mental step meant oblivion. Each monk was a universe unto himself, fighting the primal urge to coil up, to seek warmth, an urge that centuries of monastic discipline had taught them to override. Their training was not just spiritual, it was a ruthless biological reprogramming designed to make them masters of their own thermal destiny. Yet even that mastery was being tested to destruction. Lobsang shifted his internal focus rapidly through the three main phases of Tummo practice. First, the fierce one, visualizing the radiant, burning flame at the navel center. Second, the inner heat, using the specialized rhythmic breathing to fan that flame into a roaring inferno. But now he had to activate the third, the most dangerous stage, the fire that rises.
This required pulling the energy up the spine, forcing the heat to the extremities, the fingers and toes, pushing back the encroaching cold from the perimeter, fighting the cold exactly where it was gaining purchase. It was like fighting a forest fire by deliberately setting a backburn, risking total immolation to save the essential core. If the visualization faltered, the focus would snap, and the resulting shock would be instant, paralyzing hypothermia.
The sheer energy required to maintain this high-intensity metabolic state was astronomical. It burned through caloric reserves faster than a sprinter running an Olympic marathon, demanding more from the body than simple survival mechanisms. Even though they ate frugally, the stored energy was their lifeline, and it was draining like water from a cracked urn under the relentless pressure of the mountain cold. Suddenly, a soft, almost imperceptible sound broke the terrifying stillness. It was the slightest cough, a shallow, choked gasp from Brother Tenzin, situated near the back wall, where the air was most stagnant and therefore coldest and most deadly. The sound was deafening in the silence. Tenzin was young, strong, but lacked the decades of hard-won experience Lobsang possessed. The cough was involuntary. It was the body momentarily seizing control, overriding the intentional breath, a momentary breach in the wall of focus. Lobsang felt a spike of icy panic, not for himself, but for the boy whose life was now hanging by a thread. If Tenzin broke, the failure would ripple through the others, a catastrophic failure of group concentration that could unravel the entire protective thermal field they collectively generated. Lobsang could not move. To break his own perfect stillness was to abandon his own life force contribution to the collective Tumo field, damning them all. He had to communicate, not with words which would shatter the meditation, but with pure telepathic focus, sending an intense wave of stabilizing visualization toward the struggling monk. Hold the line, Tenzin. Breathe the vase. Visualize the fire. Lobsang's mind screamed the instruction, pouring his own dwindling reserves of heat into the shared psychic space of the cave, hoping the sheer force of his will could bridge the gap. The ice was creeping up Tenzin's jawline, a delicate, deathly tracery of white crystals, marking the boundary between life and the absolute stillness of the frozen peak. This was the price of the mountain's silence. This was the moment where decades of grueling self-mastery met the indifferent, absolute power of the high Himalayas. The internal flame flickered violently, threatened by the intrusion of human weakness, a weakness Lobsang had to extinguish with the brutal force of his own unwavering will, or watch the entire monastery fall to the silent, frigid fury that enveloped them. The duel had just found its first critical casualty, and the night was far from over. The casualty wasn't a sudden visible collapse, but something infinitely more sinister. The silent, total withdrawal of life's essential warmth. It was Lama Tenzin's peripheral awareness, homed over 40 years of battling the void, that screamed the alarm in the deep quiet of the dormitory. The carefully tended flicker of internal light, the psychic beacon sent by his young student, Choden, had simply gone dark. It hadn't extinguished with a struggle. It had just ceased to be, like a candle flame drawn into an abyssal vacuum. Tenzin's eyes, still closed in deep meditation, betrayed nothing, but the seismic shock of the failure rippled through his tightly controlled core. He knew the instant the core body temperature dropped past the point of no return. The precise microsecond where the hypothalamus, the master thermostat of the human machine, surrendered entirely to the invading ice. The cold didn't just stop the heart. It systematically paralyzed the brainstem, turning thought into slow, viscous sludge before freezing the mind entirely. Tenzin understood that the catastrophic implication was far beyond individual failure. Choden's passing was a breach in the synchronous thermal defense grid they had established. The air itself felt heavier, denser, almost metallic in its chilling quality. It was a stillness so profound it defied the laws of thermodynamics, sucking heat out of the very stone walls faster than the monks could generate it internally. This phenomenon, which the ancient texts terrifyingly labeled the breath of the Yeti, a mythic, Hyperborean chill, was a massive, localized pressure drop, creating an energy vacuum designed to quench all life. If Tenzin did not immediately seal that breach, the icy tendrils would spread, using Choden's rapidly freezing body as a conductor, pulling the life force from the next nearest disciple and the next, until the entire line was reduced to inert, frosted statues under a blanket of rime. The stakes were no longer about mere survival. They were now about rapid, desperate containment. To fight this, Tenzin had to do the impossible, redirect massive amounts of thermal energy while maintaining his own stability, a maneuver that carried the immediate risk of self-immolation or total metabolic collapse. Tumo, the inner fire, is far more than simple visualization. It is a complex physiological technique rooted in controlled breathing, pranayama, and intense mental focus, dharana, that forces the body to release a torrent of noradrenaline. This chemical surge triggers non-shivering thermogenesis in the deep brown fat reserves, heating the blood directly. The initial goal is to shunt blood flow from the extremities to the core to protect the organs, and then, crucially, reverse that shunt to project the heat outward without losing the internal furnace. Tenzin, however, had to attempt an emergency vascular surge.
He had to generate enough heat, not just to save himself, but to project it. A targeted thermal shock wave aimed directly at the zone where Choden lay frozen, attempting to create a defensive buffer against the creeping cold. This required accessing the deepest level of the Tumo practice, the state known as nadi purification, a biological and mental act that means pushing the human metabolic rate to genuinely unsustainable, unheard of levels.
He drew a breath so deep it felt like tearing fabric inside his lungs. He visualized the central energy channel, the Sushumna Nadi, glowing white-hot, drawing up the primal energy known as Kundalini from the base of the spine. This was not spiritual metaphor tonight. This was extreme, voluntary biofeedback, pushing his cellular mitochondria into dangerous overdrive. His core temperature spiked violently, spiking faster than any recorded fever. Sweat, generated only moments before, flash froze on his brow the instant it hit the deadly ambient air. He was oscillating wildly between internal inferno and external ice age. This was the true razor's edge. Too much internal heat, and he would suffer organ failure. Too little, and the breath of the Yeti would claim him next. He felt the resistance of the cold, a crushing, palpable weight pressing down, actively trying to quench his flame. It felt personal now. The cold had a malice, a dark sentience that seemed to react to his thermal surge with increased ferocity. He poured the generated thermal energy into his right hand, extending his spiritual will like a physical rope toward the deck monk. The air between them shimmered, not with smoke, but with the violent friction of opposing extreme temperatures. He was attempting to reignite a furnace that had already been drowned in ice, using only the volatile force of his own life energy. The projection was immediately and immensely costly. His own peripheral skin temperature began to plummet rapidly, sacrificing his extremities to protect his core and fuel the desperate life or death transfer. He was buying time with his own blood heat. The remaining line of monks remained motionless, their internal fires flickering dangerously low, dependent entirely on Tenzin's frantic energy expenditure. If he failed in the next few minutes, they would all follow Choden into the silence. He pushed harder, hearing the distant, chilling whisper of the wind transforming into a howling, predatory sound right outside the thin walls of the monastery. The master against the malice of the mountain, fighting not for victory, but for a desperately fragile stalemate against the inevitable march of the eternal freeze. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he was not just fighting the cold, he was fighting the very concept of entropy itself. The price of this thermal projection would be paid in vital heat, and Lama Tenzin was quickly running out of reserves. The internal fire, the tumo that had been his shield, didn't merely dim, it snapped. It was the soundless, invisible rupture of an ethereal pipe carrying the life-giving heat. Tenzin's body registered the catastrophic drop not as pain, but as an instantaneous, paralyzing stillness, the kind of stillness found only at the bottom of the ocean or the heart of a glacier. His extremities, moments ago tingling with vital warmth, were now screaming with the white-hot agony of freezing tissue, a process so rapid it bypassed the typical stages of discomfort and went straight to death's embrace. The air in his lungs, which he had been manipulating with the ferocious precision of a master bellows, suddenly felt thick, like pouring molten metal into his chest cavity. He was no longer breathing. He was attempting to inhale frozen dust, and the very act was draining the last vestiges of his core temperature. The deadly phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing was seconds away, where the brain, fooled by the rush of cold blood, believes the body is overheating, urging the victim to shed the very layers that might save them. This was the moment of truth that every practitioner of Tummo dreaded, the point where the meditative mind loses the struggle against the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. The cold was not external anymore. It was inside his veins, slowing his blood to a sludge, stealing the last reserves of glucose and oxygen required for conscious thought. His core temperature was plummeting, crossing the fatal threshold where the body ceases shivering, a deceptive calm before total systemic failure. He felt the heavy, crushing weight of stage 3 hypothermia settling upon him, a deep, bone-aching fatigue that whispered promises of peaceful, icy sleep. The brain, starving for heat, begins to prioritize only the essential centers, sacrificing the limbic system, sacrificing the will to live. This was the true enemy, the seductive lullaby of the high altitude, urging him to simply stop trying, to yield to the perfect, beautiful symmetry of absolute zero. But Tenzin was a lama of the highest order. His defense mechanisms were not merely physical exercises, but deep, ingrained spiritual blueprints. He knew the internal geography of survival better than the terrain outside the monastery walls. He focused with the last ounce of his mental clarity on the Sushumna Nadi, the central channel that runs along the spine, the mythic meridian that was, in reality, the esoteric furnace of his very existence. It was here, 4 finger widths below the navel, in the cauldron known as the Manipura chakra, that the primordial energy, the Kundalini, lay coiled like a sleeping subterranean serpent. The failure of his heat was a failure of the breath control, the pranayama that was supposed to force that serpent to awaken and shoot its fiery essence up the spine. He had to restart the engine, and the only fuel left was desperation and pure agonizing focus, channeled through years of brutal discipline. The mind, even in the throes of freezing, remained the commander. Tenzin knew that if the cold reached the thalamus and the brainstem, the battle was lost forever, yielding not just death, but the loss of the ability to choose life. With a convulsive, nearly impossible effort, Tenzin initiated the vase breath, Bastrika. It was a violent, rapid intake and expulsion of air, designed to create intense internal friction, a desperate attempt to create a chemical reaction in the depths of his solar plexus. Each breath was a dagger, tearing at his frozen lungs, forcing the diaphragm to contract against the solidifying muscles of his abdomen, creating a pressure cooker in the deepest part of his core. He pushed, driving the air down, bypassing the delicate upper respiratory system and slamming it straight into the core, searching for that phantom spark. He imagined the Athi fire, the inner spark, not as a gentle flame, but as a microscopic, self-sustaining fusion reaction, demanding brutal pressure and absolute containment. He was attempting to physically manifest the concept of perfect concentration into palpable thermal energy. The goal was not just warmth, but bliss heat, a thermal envelope so intense it could melt the surrounding ice, a physical manifestation of perfect concentration achieved through sheer, unadulterated spiritual will. He was trying to summon the very sun into the center of his being, while simultaneously feeling the shadow of death's grip tightening around his throat, squeezing the life out of him. As Tenzin fought this internal war, the external world was responding to his failure with brutal efficiency. The still air, which he had previously held at bay with his radiating heat, was now pressing in, a physical weight of absolute zero, amplifying the deadly chill. Tiny shards of ice, whipped up by the microscopic drafts seeping through the cracks in the ancient stone walls, began to coat his exposed skin like diamond dust, freezing the sweat he had just failed to generate. The stillness was terrifying. Even the customary creaks and groans of the ancient timbers protesting the monumental cold had ceased. The mountain itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the frail human life within the monastery walls to expire, recognizing the moment of extreme thermal equilibrium. This deep, unnatural silence was the ultimate tell. The cold had fully saturated the environment, leaving no thermal gradient whatsoever, meaning Tenzin had to fight the cold, the mountain, and the very stillness of the universe simultaneously. He knew he had mere seconds left before his motor functions shut down completely, before the cold reached the command center of his brain and extinguished consciousness. If he failed now, he would be found in the morning, not as a sleeping monk, but as a perfectly preserved statue of ice. His spiritual journey ended by the relentless, indifferent hammer of the high Himalayas. The inner flame flickered, a tiny, fragile pilot light in the overwhelming darkness, and everything depended on whether he could summon the sheer, mythic force required to turn that single, vanishing spark into an inferno. That tiny, vanishing spark, that pilot light of absolute consciousness Tenzin had desperately sought to protect, was now his only world, his only future, and his only past. He poured every ounce of his focused will, the accumulated rigor of a decade spent battling the very laws of thermodynamics, into that minuscule flame, forcing it, commanding it, to swell beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone. This wasn't merely meditation. This was the brutal, visceral engineering of human metabolism, pushed past the red line into the impossible. Tenzin's breath, meticulously controlled through the ancient, rhythmic sequence of Bhastrika Pranayama, the bellows breath, acted like pure oxygen on the ember, driving the heat upward from the deepest point of his body, the mythical energy center known as the 4 fingers below the navel. He felt the heat travel, not as a gentle warmth, but as a searing, almost painful electrical current rushing up the central energetic channel, the avaduti. This was the moment of ignition, the ultimate test, turning bone marrow into a high-octane fuel source. Outside, the air temperature was collapsing toward the theoretical limit of survivability, a crushing, deadly blanket of frozen silence that promised instant cellular death. But inside Tenzin's chest, a furnace roared into life. His core temperature, monitored only by the desperate clarity of his own mind, spiked violently. The blood that had been sluggishly moving through his veins now began to steam, carrying the volcanic surge of Tumo outward, desperately trying to fight the overwhelming external siege. He visualized the heat, not as yellow fire, but as molten, liquid red, cascading through his limbs. The skin of his chest felt taut, almost ready to burst, as if pressurized steam was trapped beneath the surface. Minutes passed, minutes that felt like geological epochs of struggle. Tenzin was no longer just sitting. He was a human geothermal vent, fighting the crushing weight of the frozen cosmos with sheer, manufactured internal heat. The steam began, first faintly, then visibly, rising from his exposed shoulders and neck, a fragile plume of life announcing defiance against the Himalayan night. This was the proof. The inner fire had caught. He was boiling the external ice with internal power. But then, the unthinkable occurred, a phenomenon so rare and so deadly that it was spoken of in the monastery archives only in hushed, terrified whispers. The silence. Not the usual, crystalline silence of the high mountains, where the snow squeaked underfoot and the wind howled its constant threat. This was a complete, absolute, crushing stillness. The barometric pressure dropped like a stone, sucking the atmospheric energy clean out of the immediate vicinity. The air, already impossibly cold, suddenly became dense, heavy, and utterly motionless. When the air stops moving, the insulating layer of warmth generated by the human body, even the tummo-generated heat, can no longer effectively radiate away or create a protective buffer. Instead, the cold instantly settles, becoming an oppressive, penetrating weight. It wasn't just cold air anymore. It felt like dipping his body into liquid nitrogen. This was a lethal, unnatural anomaly, a localized atmospheric vacuum engineered by the mountain itself to extinguish life. Tenzin's glorious, roaring internal fire was instantly challenged by an external force that bypassed the usual rules of heat transfer. The steam rising from his skin didn't dissipate. It froze immediately upon exiting, turning into a fine, deadly dusting of ice crystals on his clothes. The heat barrier was breached. The cold wasn't just on his skin. He felt it seep into the muscle tissue, a sensation so sharp it was like being stabbed with needles of black glass. His internal furnace, though still burning with volcanic intensity, was fighting a losing battle against the sheer, physical density of the cold's sudden, total infiltration. His fingers and toes, which tummo was usually meant to protect first, instantly went numb, then began to ache with the deep, sickening throb of freezing tissue. This was the paradox of the inner fire's failure. Tenzin was simultaneously burning up from the inside and freezing solid from the outside, his body caught in a terrifying thermodynamic tug-of-war that threatened to shatter his very existence. The visualization of the liquid red heat faltered. The cold had found a pathway straight to the source, chilling the central Avaduti channel itself, threatening to extinguish the flame at its root. He gasped, a short, ragged inhalation that felt like breathing shards of ice. He knew, with terrifying certainty, that if the tummo failed now, the resulting sudden core temperature drop would not be a slow descent into unconsciousness, but an instantaneous, catastrophic shutdown of the nervous system. He had seconds, perhaps less, to generate a mythic level of heat, an impossible, legendary surge, to shatter the unnatural silence and force the cold back, or he would become a perfect frozen statue in the high Himalayan night, his inner fire reduced to a mere memory of red ash. The monk, known only by his legendary practice, faced the ultimate betrayal. His core had ignited, but the signal was lost, absorbed by the catastrophic density of the surrounding cold before it could reach the outer defenses. The world outside his skin was pure, crystallized death, a pressure so immense it felt like the very oxygen molecules were shrinking away from his lungs, leaving only raw, empty vacuum in the high altitude. This was not the normal, brutal, cleansing cold of the Himalayas that merely sought to test the spirit. This was something deeper, something that attacked the very intention of the heat itself, turning visualization into ash. He roared internally, not with sound, but with the focused, devastating pressure of his perfected tumo technique, drawing every reserve of metabolic fuel he possessed, pulling energy from places the normal human body seals off as untouchable and inaccessible. For a terrifying, beautiful microsecond, the core of his sternum pulsed with the searing, volcanic heat of the inner fire, a deep, resonant orange light that fought desperately to bloom beneath his skin, attempting to reclaim the territory seized by the silent ice demon that had infiltrated his refuge. But the surge arrived too late for his fingers and toes, those distant outposts of his corporeal kingdom. They had already passed the point of no return, a chilling, dead numbness creeping up his limbs like slow-motion paralysis, a physiological betrayal that signaled imminent core temperature drop, the true, inevitable killer. The sensation was worse than pain. It was the absolute absence of sensation, the terrifying void that precedes necrosis and permanent neural damage. His eyes, wide and unflinching despite the suffocating darkness, saw spectral plumes of his own breath instantly freezing into miniature ice needles that dusted the prayer mat, a constant, horrifying reminder of the atmosphere's absolute, unwavering hostility. He knew the cardinal rule of Tumo: protect the core, maintain the furnace, and the extremities will eventually follow. But tonight, the cold was moving too fast, a hyper-accelerated attack that breached the defenses before the shield could fully raise. The unnatural element was the stillness. In the mountains, the wind was life, however cruel and cutting. It moved the air, preventing the deadly microclimate of localized freezing from setting in. Tonight, there was nothing. The great roaring breath of the mountain had ceased, leaving behind a vacuum of silent, catastrophic zero-degree stasis, amplifying the radiant heat loss tenfold, transforming his sanctuary into a pressurized deep freeze chamber. This was the true trap, a phenomenon whispered about only in the oldest scriptures, known by the terrifying name Nangsa Keel, the stillness that consumes, a rare atmospheric event where the air pressure stabilizes into a perfectly motionless, insulating layer of hypercold. This layer trapped the victim's own escaping heat against their skin, accelerating the freezing process in a terrifying, deadly feedback loop. Every single calorie of heat he generated was instantly vaporized and then held close, a mocking shroud of his own failure, feeding the stillness. He had to instantly abandon the standard Tumo meditation, the introductory generating heat stage that relied on simple visualization of the flame, because the visualization was failing him. The internal image was being extinguished by external, physical reality. He shifted instantly, brutally, into the higher, infinitely more dangerous stage, the melting stage, Tsalung, a technique typically reserved for deep, esoteric practice, and never meant for raw survival scenarios, due to its immense energetic cost and the high risk of catastrophic neural overload. This required him to forcibly manipulate the prana, life energy, through the central channel, known as the Sushumna Nadi, a path only masters dare to tread. He forced the flow downwards, reversing the natural course of energy, igniting the mystical center located 4 finger widths below the navel, the source point of all vital warmth. The legendary Dral Wakime, the Vajra fire. It was like trying to start a jet engine with a flint and steel, relying purely on the focused, incandescent intensity of his practiced mind to create a physical, measurable reality change in his molecular structure. A low, guttural sound, unheard even by his own ears, escaped his lips as he twisted the energy. Veins stood out like ropes on his neck and forehead, his muscles momentarily convulsing with the sheer, agonizing force of internal. A low, guttural sound, unheard even by his own ears, escaped his lips as he twisted the energy. Veins stood out like ropes on his neck and forehead, his muscles momentarily convulsing with the sheer, agonizing force of internal concentration, a sign that the sympathetic nervous system was screaming in overdrive, pouring every last drop of adrenaline and cortisol into the fight against immediate systemic collapse. But the extreme, uncontrolled effort came at a cost that went beyond Tenzin's own body's capacity. The massive spike in internal heat began to generate a localized, intense humidity immediately surrounding his body, a cloud of vapor that, upon meeting the instantaneous freezing point of the surrounding -40°C air, would instantly freeze solid, creating a thin, hard shell of deadly rime ice on the floor, locking him in. If he failed to maintain this exact, impossible pressure, that shell would become his tomb, locking him forever into a posture of meditation, a terrifying monument to the very limits of human endurance and the merciless nature of the high peaks. And worse, he could no longer afford to hold back. He had to draw on the latent spiritual heat of the entire monastery, the collective energy generated by hundreds of years of focused practice, channeling the shared consciousness of the lineage to fuel his solitary inferno. He reached out, mentally, psychically, feeling the rhythmic, desperate, shallow breathing of the other sleeping monks scattered throughout the dark, immense hall, each one unknowingly drawing on their own internal reserves, struggling against the exact same insidious, suffocating cold. Tenzin was not just fighting for himself now. He was fighting to keep the stillness from claiming the entire lineage, the knowledge, and the future. The inner fire, now fully unleashed via the high-risk Tsa Lung practice, was no longer a gentle, controlled warmth. It was a roaring, uncontrollable beast, threatening to consume him entirely. The boundary between generating life and burning up becoming perilously thin and blurred. He felt the terrifying, sharp agony of the heat pushing against his brainstem, the physiological limit approaching the point of rupture, knowing that if he pushed even one fraction harder, the effort would kill him faster than the cold. But the grip of Nang Sakil on his hands was tightening, the bones beneath the skin feeling brittle, glass-like, threatening to shatter under the internal and external stress. He had unleashed the inferno, but the question remained, suspended in the hyper-still, deadly air. Could he control the beast long enough to melt the deadly ice that was already coating the inside of his lungs, before the heat itself became the executioner? Pema was no longer meditating. He was wrestling a furious, trapped sun in the cage of his ribs. His consciousness, usually a vast, calm ocean, was now a single terrified lighthouse, scanning the turbulent waves of his own thermoregulatory system. The heat, the tumo fire roared up the central channel, the Sushumna Nadi, but it wasn't a steady, purifying flame. It was a volcanic eruption, threatening to vaporize the very moisture he needed to survive the arid killer air of the plateau. Every breath was a surgical calculation. Inhale too deeply, and the new, deadly cold air would quench the unstable core, sending his temperature plummeting towards the critical failure point, the point where the blood thickens into sludge and the brain stops sending orders. Exhale too violently, and he risked expelling the pressurized heat, creating a vacuum in his core that the external world, the monstrous, omnipresent cold, would instantly rush in to fill and solidify. The true enemy was the stillness. Outside the cave mouth, the wind had ceased, a meteorological impossibility at this altitude in midwinter, leaving behind a crushing, dense blanket of air, so cold it felt physically heavier than stone. This absence of movement meant that the thin layer of warmth Pema's tumo generated around his skin was not being replaced by new, slightly less lethal air, forcing him to keep escalating the internal fire just to maintain the static bubble of survival. The other monks, scattered like stones in the frozen cavern, were silent, too silent. Their collective internal humming, the low, steady vibration of dozens of regulated tumo furnaces, had diminished, replaced by the sickeningly faint sound of labored, shallow gasps. Pema knew the physiology of failure intimately. Standard human defense, shivering thermogenesis, was a useless, energy-wasting panic in this realm. It would exhaust the body's reserves in minutes. Tumo, the inner fire yoga, bypassed that crude mechanism by consciously controlling the basal metabolic rate, tapping into reserves of brown fat and energy reservoirs usually locked away. But the cold was relentless, driving his body's automatic response system into panic mode despite his practice. His extremities were already functionally dead, the blood vessels constricted to hair-thin tubes, rerouting precious, superheated blood solely to the core. His fingers were hard glass, his toes useless shards. If the core temperature dropped just 1 degree Celsius more, from the precarious 37.5 degrees Celsius he was fighting to maintain, the cascading failure would begin. Cardiac arrhythmia, confusion, and then the final, non-negotiable sleep. He desperately focused on the visualization technique, the key to igniting the inner sun. He visualized the central energy channel, the sushumna, running vertically through his spine, and at the navel chakra, the roaring, molten orange syllable, Ram. He had to hold the breath in the lower abdomen, the vase breathing, tightening the muscles to pressurize the prana and force it down, compressing the volatile energy until it ignited the visualization. Failure to maintain the seal meant the energy would dissipate, harmlessly leaking out through his mouth and nostrils, leaving him defenseless against the sub-zero siege. But the pain was a distraction, a screaming banshee tearing at his concentration. The rapid succession of heating and cooling, the tumo oscillating wildly, the rapid succession of heating and cooling, the tumo oscillating wildly, was causing micro-tears in his capillaries, flooding his system with agonizing biochemical signals. He risked opening his eyes, a monumental effort that felt like cracking frozen granite. Across the cave, the young novice, Lobsang, was starting to sway. Lobsang had only achieved the first level of tumo mastery, enough to dry a single wet sheet in the summer, perhaps, but nowhere near the power needed to withstand this geological freezing event. Lobsang was murmuring, lost in a hypoxic, hypothermic delirium, his mind already succumbing to the comforting delusion that he was lying on a sun-drenched beach, convinced he felt the warmth of sand. Pema knew that delusion was death's sweetest whisper. The body, confused by the freezing temperature and lack of oxygen, tricks the victim into feeling overwhelmingly hot, prompting them to strip off clothing. A final, fatal error. He couldn't move. Moving would break his core seal, instantly sacrificing his own life. He had to reach Lobsang with his mind, transmitting the stability, the pure, unyielding focus of the Ram syllable, crossing the distance not through flesh, but through sheer force of will, and the subtle energetic currents of the prana. The moisture he had successfully melted inside his lungs was now the enemy outside. It had condensed instantly on the ceiling of the cavern, forming razor-sharp icicles that grew with shocking speed, extending downward like the stalactites of a frozen mouth. One monstrous spike, thick as a man's forearm, hung directly over Lobsang's head, vibrating faintly with the barely perceptible tremors of the earth's deep freeze. If Lobsang shifted, if his body convulsed in the throes of the final metabolic crash, the ceiling of ice would shatter and descend, burying him instantly, silencing the last vestiges of human warmth in that desolate chamber. Pema realized the sheer, horrifying irony. He was fighting to prevent the internal formation of ice by generating fire, while simultaneously the heat he was creating was fueling the external enemy, providing the necessary humidity for the cave walls to grow their crystalline daggers. This was the ultimate test of the bodhisattva ideal, to sacrifice the self for the sake of others, even when that sacrifice meant facing the inevitable blackness of the void. Pema had 20 seconds, no more, before Lobsang's oxygen-starved brain would trigger the final involuntary spasm that would bring down the roof. He had to pump more heat, generating such a massive, unsustainable burst of tumo that the sheer thermal energy would radiate outwards, not just heating Lobsang's core, but physically melting the base of the deadly icicle above him. It was a suicidal maneuver. Pumping the core furnace beyond its structural capacity meant accepting immediate systemic failure. His own blood vessels would rupture under the sudden explosive pressure, turning the controlled fire into a deadly internal hemorrhage. But the alternative was watching the boy die, a failure that would haunt his rebirths for 1,000 eons. With a soundless, terrifying roar of acceptance, Pema drew in the deepest, most compressed breath of his life, sealing the bandhas with crushing force, and drove the molten ram syllable into a state of hypercritical mass, betting everything on the milliseconds before his own body turned to ash.